Hi, welcome back to the channel. I'm Traben, and this will be the first in a series I'm calling Treasured Tomes, in which I highlight some of my absolute favorite reads. Today, we're looking at the Massiveverse. To really understand why I love the Massiveverse so much, I first have to talk about my love for tokusatsu. For those who aren't aware, tokusatsu is the Japanese term for special effects, and it's used to refer primarily to the action hero series that show up on Saturday mornings in Japan. So Super Sentai or Kamen Rider or Ultraman all fall under the banner of tokusatsu, as do kaiju films like Godzilla. For those who have watched my channel before, you'll have seen that I have been reading through the Ultraman manga from Japan, as well as the Rise of Ultraman comic from Marvel. And I've been lukewarm on some of them, 3 to 4 stars. But the reason why I was attracted to this in the first place was my love for this genre and for this type of storytelling. My first entry into the Massiveverse was actually a Kickstarter for Inferno Girl Red. At the time, I wasn't aware that this was going to fold into a larger connected universe. I just knew that it was a story where the author had said that they were inspired by series like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai to create this character and to create this story. The author of Inferno Girl Red, Matt Groom, was actually one of the driving forces behind Boom Studios' Mighty Morphin Power Rangers run, which I believe began around 2017 or 2018. I have the first 4 volumes here, and this is another comic that I had been picking up and been enjoying, as it took a spin on the American adaptation of Super Sentai Power Rangers, but modernized it and reimagined it for a slightly more mature audience. Kyle Higgins, the main writer for Boom Studios' Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, had released a new IP in 2020 called Radiant Black, and since then has been pulling in other people who were working on the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers comic to a shared universe with Toku-inspired heroes. I'm going to talk about why I enjoy the Massiveverse so much, going through all the titles that I currently own, as well as talking about, in general, why a imprint like this is so important and why it leads to more creative storytelling opportunities than a mainline Marvel or DC property, or even something like Boom Studios' Power Rangers. Some of Higgins' earlier work back in 2011 was on a run of Nightwing for DC Comics. Now, I was not familiar with that run. I asked my partner, who is a big fan of Nightwing, if she could recall what was happening at that time. But as far as I can tell from a brief look online, the run was considered mediocre due to a lot of executive meddling. And this is really an issue with the mainline comics. Kyle Higgins' run was mostly remembered for constantly being interrupted by these company-wide crossover events. And so while some people appreciated the storytelling that was going on, they said that that got muddled and kind of pushed to the side because of all these other things that were happening. I believe this is right around the time of New 52, and so there were a lot of events going on that outside forces were influencing the stories that Higgins could tell in his run. Even something like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, while this did give some freedom to the writers, is still somewhat hampered by the fact that you're dealing with pre-existing characters and the fact that Saban brand probably had some influence over the choices made here and the way their IP was being represented. So even with Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which I feel like did a good job of modernizing the story and telling more adult stories with these characters, there's still that corporate oversight that stymies creativity on some level. Creator-owned content like Radiant Black is really where Higgins is able to tell the exact story that he wants to, not confined by any kind of continuity or any kind of corporate meddling. And I think that the story is stronger as a result. The downside to this, of course, is that while people will recognize Nightwing and they'll recognize Power Rangers, there is an established market for those properties. Radiant Black has to start from zero, and it can be very difficult for these creator-owned properties to gain traction. Fortunately, I believe the Massiveverse was received very well by critics. I have 6 comic lines or 6 comic titles from this imprint that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to do so in a way that hopefully flows from one to the next, where you can kind of see the connections between these titles. But one of the important things to understand about the Massiveverse is that other than their occasional supermassive one-shots, the stories are more or less standalone, and while it is said that these characters all exist in the same universe, there is not a lot of that continuity and crossing over between the characters from title to title. So if one of these sounds interesting to you, but you could pass on the others, then you could still pick up that title and not have any kind of conflict with not understanding the overall story. I'm going to start with Radiant Black because that is the beginnings of the universe. The beginnings of the Massiveverse was Radiant Black. So this is written by Higgins. It follows the story of Nathan Burnett as he finds a black hole one night, and when he touches it, he turns into Radiant Black. And one of the things I really like about this series is that it deals with the idea that the hero themselves is kind of overwhelmed by what is going on in the world around them. They're kind of thrown into the deep end with this power and with all the negative consequences as well as the benefits it comes with that are associated with it. This would be like the Super Sentai or Power Rangers analog, the closest analog to that kind of storytelling, that kind of super team in the Massiveverse, because there is not only Radiant Black, we've got Radiant Red, Radiant Yellow, and Radiant Pink. Another aspect that I really like about this story is that each of the Radiants has their own background and their own stories. They're not a cohesive unit. They don't even know each other at the start of the story, and there are sections of the comic that don't deal with the team dynamics at all. A lot of this is just Radiant Black trying to deal with the fallout from him becoming a superhero and trying to make decisions that are the correct ones, and it's not a clean good versus evil, black and white kind of story. A lot of morally gray area in this book. There's also one of the most surprising twists I've seen in a comic early on in this run that has just now, at the end of volume 3, kind of reached a point where I can see what the author had originally intended to get to. But there's a very shocking moment early on in volume 1 that you will not see coming and changes the entire trajectory of this story. I would recommend this one if you are interested in the idea of a hero struggling to do the right thing. If you're interested in a story of someone who starts off not being a heroic person, acquires these powers, and has to try their best to do good with them. I would also highly recommend this just for the art. The art in this is gorgeous. There are some full page spreads that were amazing, and it went really well with the storytelling that was happening. A lot of morally gray characters, a lot of things where there's not a clean answer to what is the right thing to do. So that's the first book. Let's take a look at Radiant Red. There have been 2 direct offshoots from Radiant Black so far. In Radiant Red, as well as Radiant Pink, which I do not own. Radiant Red is written by Cherish Chen. I believe that this is one of her earliest comic book writing gigs. And I have to say that, again, if you're interested in morally gray characters and you want to look at just a character study of someone who is doing bad things for good reasons, or at least what they think are good reasons, then Radiant Red would be an excellent book to pick up. The main character here is a multifaceted character. She has a lot going on in her life. It's very complicated, and it deals a lot with identity and who you are and the choices you make. And what do you do when your back's up against the wall and you have a way to fix it, even though the way to fix it is not the best plan and is not the right thing to do, but you're desperate and you need to get out of this situation. So again, another very strong title, and it serves as a good backdrop to Radiant Black, because Radiant Red is one of the first antagonists to come along in that story. Not to say that she is an outright villain, but she is one of the first major conflicts that Radiant Black has, and this does a very good job of fleshing out her character and giving more context to the actions in Radiant Black. That being said, I still think you could read Radiant Red on its own if you're more interested in this character's story. It's another strong entry in the series. Moving on to the next title, we have Rogue Sun. Now, the second volume of this is out. I only have volume 1. However, I still feel like this is another really strong entry into the Massiveverse. This is one of 2 comics in the Massiveverse that deals with generational relationships and generational trauma. So in this story, Rogue Sun is the son of a character named Rogue Sun, and their dynamic between inheriting this power as well as their strained relationship is what is the driving force behind this story. And a lot of the ideas in this come back to family, and oftentimes not a family that is a stable one. This is not a character with a stable home life. At the beginning of the story, I did not like this character at all. By the end of this story, I didn't really think I liked this character much on a personal level, but the writing is still incredibly strong, and I feel like where this story ends up is some of the strongest tying together of the familial relationship and the ideas presented in superhero comics of like protecting your loved ones and protecting your identity, and just the fact that Rogue Sun, in his entire story, is wrapped up in his family, both his mother and his estranged father. It makes for a very interesting read, and I'm very excited to pick up the next volume and see where this heads. I would say this is probably one of the darker stories in the Massiveverse. So if you're a fan of more of like the Punisher style or kind of that darker mood, that darker atmosphere, this might be where you'd want to start. Again, there's not a lot of carryover from the other titles. Unlike Radiant Red, this is not a direct offshoot of Radiant Black. You might also equate this as the strongest connection to maybe like an Ultraman type story, only in that it has that legacy vibe to it. The direction it takes and the tone it has is a far departure from those series, but just in the connection, the fact that this is like a legacy title handed down from father to son is something that is a connective tissue between this and one of the mainline toku shows. That brings us back to Inferno Girl Red, which again was my first foray into the Massiveverse. Inferno Girl Red is the second title that has this kind of generational element to it, The main difference here is that, unlike Rogue Sun, where that relationship is strained and the familial tie is one that is a source of conflict in the story, here Inferno Girl Red and her mother, who is the previous Inferno Girl Red, are working together. They have a healthy relationship. I would say Inferno Girl Red is probably the closest to a Kamen Rider series. Some of the poses that are pulled off in here and some of the text overlays when they do the transformations seem right out of something you'd see in Kamen Rider 01 or something like that. And the idea of just having a character whose powers are tied to the villain in some way, as well as having these upgraded forms throughout the story, is something that you see a lot in the Kamen Rider franchise. So this remains one of my favorites. Like the sci-fi elements of the story, the city that they are in is teleported away into space, which seems very much like the plot of Power Rangers Lost Galaxy. And so that's also a very nostalgic feeling. She primarily fights these like darkness monsters. So again, that element of the sci-fi and the kind of horror and fantasy together make this one of the titles that I enjoy the most. This is a story of inherited power and one of family and community. Being cut off from the rest of the world, our protagonist Cassia is having to build her own community in this isolated city where she also knows that her greatest enemies reside. This one also deals with some of the highest stakes. There is a multiversal threat in this story, and you only have the singular hero. So it might also be a good choice for those who like that lone superhero against incredible odds kind of story. So another one that I would highly recommend. I want to point out that Higgins and Groom are both writers on The Rise of Ultraman, which I found a little surprising because this kind of fell flat for me. And again, I'm wondering if it is the constraints put on them by Marvel or by Subaraya, the owners of the Ultraman IP, in that I just did not vibe with this the way that I am with the Massiveverse. With an imprint like this, you're trading that name recognition, you're trading that notoriety for a lot of freedom in storytelling. It felt like a very safe title. Having the pressure from Marvel and from Subaraya to make the story a certain way or to fall into certain kind of parameters and limiting the freedom of the writers in doing so. One more to get to, and then there's a final thing to discuss, one more work to talk about. And this one is probably the one that was the most disappointing to me because it looked so good from the previews, and when I picked it up, I was kind of disappointed with the pacing and the story itself. So this is The Dead Lucky. This follows our protagonist Bibiana, who is an ex-soldier who has the power to see her dead platoon as points of energy and draw on that to create her power. Unfortunately, few aspects of that story are given the time to breathe that they need to in this comic. It's one of those that I've talked about in the past that's just jumping from action point to action point. So it's a little unfortunate. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue this one. I really like the suit design, and the story has a lot of potential. It has a lot of different avenues for storytelling, so we'll see. I'll probably pick up volume 2, but I would say that Dead Lucky is probably my least favorite in the Massiveverse. But again, one of the benefits of this imprint is that they don't really cross over that often. So if I drop Dead Lucky, I can still enjoy all the other titles without having to follow the story that's happening in here. The last things I wanted to talk about is some of Higgins' earlier work in Cowl has now been folded into the Massiveverse. More recent issues of Radiant Black that I've read have directly referenced it, have talked about the in-universe love that some of the characters have for the figures in Cal. So I have not read Cal yet, but my understanding is that this is has been folded into the multiverse, and this is basically like your JSA kind of title, where it's an older group of superheroes. They don't actually have superpowers. I believe they're mostly reliant on technology for the basis of their superhero feats, and it looks like a very clandestine, very mysterious organization. But at the point in Radiant Black that we're at, there are characters who look up to the members of Cal, and there are movies made for them, and comic books and things like that, or books that people read. So this is another title that is technically within the Massiveverse. I believe this ended its run quite a while ago. It's interesting to see how the creator tied some of his previous work to his current project. So another one to look for if you're interested in the entirety of the Massiveverse line. So what do I rate these titles? And keep in mind, this is Treasured Tomes, so I am talking about something that I enjoy greatly. So I would say for Radiant Black, every single issue of this, every single trade paperback that I've gotten from this series has been super strong. I've rated every single one of the trade paperbacks a 5. I think they are all solid storytelling, very surprising twists, interesting development, and an ongoing story that is hard to figure out what is going to happen next. But each time there's a new development, it builds off of what came before, and it is creating this story of a very strong friendship in a morally gray world. Likewise, the one issue of Radiant Red that I have picked up, I would rate a 5. It is another strong character study with a multifaceted lead that has to grapple with difficult choices, and you might not always agree with the choices that she is making, but you can understand why she makes those choices. For Rogue Sun, it's another 5. This one gets it for the generational trauma, the family dynamics, the strained relationships, and the way that that is woven into a superhero story with supervillains and antagonists and their powers. It is just a very clever take on the superhero genre, and a little bit darker than the other titles. I feel like that's to its benefit because it's telling something different. It's telling a different kind of story. And so it's refreshing to read this after having read through a Radiant Black, which is a little bit more lighthearted in parts. This strikes me as a lot more serious in tone. For Inferno Girl Red, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this is another 5 for me. Kamen Rider is my favorite of the superhero tokusatsu shows, and like I said, I feel like the vibes of Kamen Rider show through most clearly in this title. It's also probably helped by the fact that I was following the Kickstarter while it was going and heard about the creator's inspirations and got to see some of the art beforehand and go into it knowing that I was going to enjoy the story here. So another 5-star rating for Inferno Girl Red. And that leads to the only lackluster title, Dead Lucky. It's a 3-star. It's something that I don't even recall much about what's going on. I struggled to talk about this in this ranting review because it's just, there's not enough character development in this one. Now, the writer of this, I believe, is also the writer for Radiant Pink, so I will have to pick up that title, see if it's a stronger title due to its association with Radiant Black and having that character already be someone who I've been introduced to before, or if this is an issue with the writer in general in just not being able to develop those characters to the level that these other titles are doing it. And that's it for my look at the Massiveverse. Please sound off in the comments and let me know if this is an imprint that you've looked at before, if you've picked up any of these titles and what your thoughts were. Let me know, are you a fan of superhero comics? Are you a fan of tokusatsu? Does any of this resonate with you the way that it resonates with me? And if not, like, what kind of comics do you pick up? What kind of titles are you interested in? I really do want this to be a community, so I appreciate you listening to me rant about all these comics for the last bit, and I hope you look forward to the next Treasure Tomes. Have a good day.